Hello and welcome to The Wizard and the Priestess. I am Nuala and my co-host is... Woo!
That's our new intro from now on.
Matt really likes the sound effects.
I'm a fan.
So today we're going to move straight into episode 19 and we're going to be talking about mental health. And just to touch on that, mental health, something that we don't realise, but we're all just a little bit fucked up.
Just a little bit in our own little way. Yep.
Jump on in, Matt.
Well, there's such a stigma and a dogmatic viewpoint about mental health. And just like everything else we've spoken about, you get diagnosed with something, then you're put into that box. With that box, there's a whole thing of conditions, and then you start to identify with that. So these diagnoses really have a double-edged sword. It can put you into a box, therefore you can and can't do things according to those boxes that you're now being put in with the diagnosis, but also giving something a label can also allow the ego to navigate it a little bit easier. So whether it's depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, whatever it is that being handed the diagnosis, it can work either way. So someone who's been diagnosed with depression, for example, will now be depressed on that diagnosis.
Maybe.
Yeah, potentially, absolutely. But also if they've been given that diagnosis, their ego can then navigate a path because then they've actually put words to how they're feeling, which in itself can be quite therapeutic. So there's the double-edged sword.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess that also in our systemic approach, when we get a label or diagnosis, we can then access certain treatments.
Mm-hmm.
I think mental health is sort of an interesting one because I guess, well, one of the things is when I've done a bit of psych in university, some of the aspects of that, essentially it is a theoretic framework that is as close to being out of this world and really deficient of science as it is to be in the world and very scientific.
Yeah,
so
okay.
I have a few psychologists around me and family and friends, and it's the way that I've in time learnt about the processing, like psychology itself, like as a framework of practice is only very new to the scientific model. Whereas prior to that, it was very probably more esoteric. And kind of if we look at like the Freudian views or I can't think of the other psychoanalytical.
Well, Carl Jung's a big one.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, yeah, that's like the sort of the grandfathers of that. But it's sort of, yeah, so where these pieces come from and environment versus genetics kind of thing.
Yeah. Innate versus acquired type thing.
Yes. Yep. So all of those pieces, like it wasn't too long ago that psychology was quite out of the box. Whereas now it's been put into the box, and I think that slowly there's been a bit of an unpacking with that box. So, anyway, that sort of felt a bit of a side note.
Well, no, I think that's a really good point because a couple 100 years ago, where they needed, like for example, in native tribes, someone who was schizophrenic was seen as like a wise man,
or the opposite, depending, right? So they could have been seen as the wise man, but if they were, as the time went on, maybe not even too far from, like deeply if they were schizophrenic, they were wise, but then also they were seen as being the person like that's been shunned from the tribe. I had an example that's not kosher. Anyway. Yeah, fully.
Yeah.
So it's, and I guess one thing that I would say is that still today, you don't necessarily need to be like, the reason I want to say this is just because like being some form of a psychic or some form of a energetic connected to something greater than self, like and feeling a medium or being interconnected to something that is more outside of self could sometimes be seen as a mental health issue. And so I just want to kind of maybe separate that, but also identify that it's a very fine line.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And being really conscious of how, I don't know.
Well, someone who is, let's say, I think everyone's a bit psychic.
Oh, absolutely.
Firstly, so we've all got our voyances, clairsentience, clairaudience, clairvoyance, etc. The word clair means clear. So clairvoyance means clear vision, clairaudience, clear hearing, clairsentience, clear feeling. It's a extra perceptory sense that we get that is outside our own, what we'd call normal five senses. So it's an extra bit of information that we gather from a field that we can't see with our physical eyes. You have to turn your third eye on to perceive that, or your third ear, or however that applies to the person.
Third nose, potentially.
Yeah. So there's all these senses that we do have. Some nurture them, some people don't. And it's also, if you see auras, if you see things that aren't physically here, as a typical clairvoyant would, and you don't know what to do with that, that can send you a bit crazy as well. So it's you being able not to contain that within yourself, which can go back to everything we've spoken about, not, having a sense of self, et cetera, et cetera. But I remember as a kid being clairsentient and just looking at someone and knowing exactly where they were at. I knew exactly what kind of day they've had, et cetera, et cetera. I never asked people how they were because I already knew. And I got in trouble for that because I wasn't being polite, asking how people were. And I thought that was normal, but evidently not. So I just blocked that out and didn't really allow that to come in till I was kind of late 20s. But I felt left out. I felt like I was the weird one. Shut up. So
did not say a thing.
Yeah. So
I guess what we want to, and fully. So that's just kind of touching on that idea that, so a couple of 100 years ago when things were different, we probably would have seen someone like yourself or seen, young children that had those clairs opened and were expressing those, and we would have taken them in as somewhat of a gift. And I too believe today that most children have these gifts, and quickly we are kind of snapping them out of that.
Yeah.
And so we have a choice in that whether we want to open that space. And obviously there's aspects to this that can feel very foreign and uncomfortable for people. So it's it can feel a little bit like, no, that's too far beyond where I am. But I just want to reiterate that psychology itself as a framework of practice was there not so long ago. And even recent times, I was speaking to a friend who was in the midst of studying psychology, and she was explaining to me that there's two thought frameworks in terms of thought. And one is that there is a whole other timeline happening at the same time. So quantum, I don't know if it's called quantum physics as such, but quantum idea. So this idea that there is this timeline.
There's some kind of quantum theory, yeah.
Quantum theory, that is happening at the same timeline, and those bounce into us.
Yep.
And so it's already happened. Everything's already happened. Or the other framework is that the brain thinks it up itself. Or the wires create this mesh or whatever that is. So they're essentially what's being taught at university. One is that it could be this quantum idea, and one is that the brain's chemicals do the thinking and create the
imbalances.
Imbalances or the vibrations or we have a little bit of this here, a little bit of this here, a little bit of that, and that creates this spark, which creates this thought and this whatever. I don't think that's exactly it, but I'm just going to use that because it feels simple. But it's like this tangible idea that we can measure. We can look at the brain. We can measure how its waves are. We can measure how much quantities of different hormones or different, it's hormones, right? Chemicals, different chemicals in the brain and in the body, and then we can understand why there's certain thinking patterns and processes.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand,
that's more of a comfortable view to take, I would say.
Absolutely.
So if you've been diagnosed with mental illness, let's say, then there must be something wrong with the brain. That's a very Western left brain approach. Yes, the brain plays a part, absolutely. And from a manual therapy viewpoint, circulation to the brain can also play a huge viewpoint. Dietary plays a huge viewpoint, probably arguably one of the biggest kind of.
Well, if we're talking about chemicals and amounts of chemicals, that is the 72 hours of chemical in, digestion out. It makes sense that there is a form of chemical going in.
So those neurotransmitters and those neurons, those motor synapses need to be firing in a certain sequence, but there's no thought in the brain. There's only processing of information. So to the degree you can't process said information, then you can see how you get your wires crossed. So that's where that would play into it. That's where I would give it validation. But outside that, any kind of attempt to balance the chemistry in the brain for that kind of thing is only going to dull down the senses.
Yeah, and I mean, you only have to. I did some form of neurobiology course or pharmacognosy, which essentially is like.
Is that part of your degree?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I loved my Zoran, was the best lecturer I've ever had, and he's just like as practical as it comes. But because he's so practical, he's so clear and honest, and he would talk about like. Isn't it? That he say all the time. It was the best thing, and I really enjoyed every class I had with him, because he would really just be like, the medication that we're using to medicate the brain, he would say something like, we put this in here, we understand how the synapse takes it on, and then we understand how it plays out over here, and what happened in the middle, no idea. It was crazy.
Where was he from?
I don't know.
Is that an accurate?
Perfectly accurate depiction of Zoran's voice.
Cool.
I actually don't know that his name's Zoran now that I say it. But anyone that went to my uni would know exactly who I'm talking about. I wonder if he's still... he was fantastic. But what I want to reiterate there is the medication, like NSAIDs and a lot of... there's another version that is sort of similar, but essentially it is blocking synapses. Essentially it stops the synapse here. Yeah. We don't know what goes on in the middle, but we sort of understand what comes out at the other side. Okay. So when they're doing the studies on these drugs, there's like this... I'm going to go in a whole new world, but it's like there's a really interesting research that's out there that essentially is like, well, we think this is best practice because it's been used. And so therefore that is one of the biggest things in medical practice, is that we use this drug or this functional medicine or whatever it might be because we see it as best practice. So when we do our research, we research against what is currently best practice. Whether or not that is best practice or not, we use that, and it's accepted in the scientific community that we can research against that because that is currently used and is the best practice.
That's just the most familiar.
Most familiar.
That's it.
Absolutely.
Yep. And
when you look at some of the drugs that we went through, like we went through a lot of the different like psychotic drugs or antipsychotic drugs or antidepressant drugs or whatever might be used with whatever label, anything that was going to impact the synapses of the brain, any drug that went in to kind of block them or boost them, or there was a piece in the middle of the processing that no one knows what's happening there. And they're hypothesizing what might be happening there, but they actually don't know. So they block it at one end, they see a result at the other end, and what happens in the middle is magic. And it's a bit of an indicator that when people are put onto these medications that, yes, it absolutely blocks things. So that is that feeling of when you get put onto, or they recommend, you know what, you're feeling all these feelings, you're a bit out of order. Let's just give you this medication that's going to slow down that disorder and bring you back to a little bit of balance.
Yeah.
But I can't really tell you what's happening. All I know is I'm blocking something, and hopefully the result is what has been shown in the research, that is you feel numb.
Then you just become a statistic.
Yeah.
In other words, yeah.
And it's sort of when, I guess for me, when I'm treating, and like I was saying this before we started today, is that nearly everything is an emotional or a mental disorder. From a holistic perspective, there is no body without the soul, without the mental, without the emotional. It is all one encompassing being. So I can't treat you, or I can absolutely just treat your physical ailment. However, I'll always be finding the emotional ailment in that too.
And when you do treat the physical aspect only, you do a lot more than you think you know. So you're always going to have some kind of mental, emotional effect. Absolutely.
And I can say, look, that was something that happened fairly recently with me and my child, and I took her to a clinician, very well-renowned, beautiful clinician. And we had a very out-of-this-world experience. And I was wanting from the clinician to understand what she understood was happening, and she didn't understand.
Right.
And then I went to another clinician, and she explained to me from her perspective what it was that potentially happened and how there was some form of metaphysical experience that was going on, because I felt that.
And kids are tapped into that.
Oh, absolutely.
So much more than we are.
Absolutely. So I had this, and when I had a different treatment with a different practitioner who had a little bit more of a, had a little bit more of an outside perspective.
Outside the box, yeah.
She was able to explain to me and express to me that actually when she treated my child, she was like, oh man, she didn't realize what she did, but she opened a portal for her. And now I had to bring her back in. And so I imagine that there's things like this happening, especially for little children who are so right brain dominant, who are so connected to the outside of themselves, we're literally slowly gathering them together and putting them into this beautiful little box that we think is the best box for them. And we're squeezing them in, and then we're pushing them in. And when they step out of line, we gently, slowly bring them back in. And I mean, I feel like I'm quite a conscious parent, and I'm doing obviously the best I can, like every parent is doing. They're doing the best they can with what they have. But I'm absolutely not immune. I am gently curating this beautiful box for my child or children. And when I get these sort of awakening experiences where I'm like, that didn't feel right, or at least I didn't feel held in that moment. And it's not to say that practitioner wasn't fantastic at what she did, but I didn't feel held, and I didn't know what was going on. And then when I stepped into another place and I was given another space or a second opinion, I was like, wow, that makes so much sense. And so when it comes to these sort of mental health, chemical imbalances, ideologies that, we're all a little bit fucked up. We all have a little bit of these chemical imbalances, because that is essentially the framework that creates our mental configuration. And that is my favorite word this month. But it is like, that is essentially it. And when we understand that we're all going to be a little bit, skew-if because of the layers of experience that have been passed down, that then we have the choice whether or not to go with or against in that configurative moment, which is those years of 0 to 7 years. We're literally configuring this energy, and that is setting us up for the future. And it is really interesting what actually is aligned. And I mean, you could look at, I'm not going to go there, but let's just come to, sorry, if I went there, I'd just go off on another tangent, but I just want to bring it back to that idea of mental health and fitting inside a box. We're all trying to fit inside a form of box, and that box ideally is planted from the self and heart-centered. And as a parent, I watch my kids every day, and I'm trying to be as conscious as I can to like not push them in a direction that isn't for them. Like, I want them to go to bush school. Do they really want to go to bush school? Is that really like, I've read the research. I know that the literature says children outside is the best thing for a child's brain and discovery and imagination, and that feels really important for me. But I know my child's quite analytic, and I know that she likes to deeply think. Am I supporting her? And I've got another example of that with children. So when we look at a child, I always look at their shape of their body, how they're formed, how their body moves. I'm just becoming aware of it. And if I have a child in my clinic, I'm very conscious of how the sway of their back is, how their energy stands, how tall like a tree, how solid they are, how grounded they are, and what aspects, what's being configured here. And then, for example, I have a teacher that I've done a bit of work with children, and his expression is, from a TCM perspective, if we see this big sway in a little child's back, it's a demonstration that there's a deficiency in the water element, which is in the kidney base. So we've got this weakness in the lower back, weakness in the lower spine. What usually that's because of is so much thinking. So we have this aspect that there's this we're taking the energy from the base, from that deep energy that's been given to them from birth or from conception. And that energy we start to tax, and we use it in their brain. And especially if they're under 7, we can tax a lot. And so then what are we doing? We're also malnourishing the bones, because the bones are interlinked to the water element and the kidney. So we're sort of creating this malnourishment in that way. And it could be that mum was just thinking a lot through pregnancy. So she already, the cup where she poured into the kidney channel was actually a bit deficient or depleted in that sense too. So there might have been a little bit lacking in that point as well. No pressure. But it's this idea that then understanding that, okay, so this kid was this incredible pianist. He's 5 or 6 years old. I think he played piano, some form of instrument. But it was a really really deep thinking process that he was doing, and he was fantastic at it. No, it wasn't piano, it was chess. Anyway, he was really good at chess. He liked it. So he's using his brain. He was really analytical in that space. But then when he came in, because obviously there was other aspects, he was sort of malnourished, and he looked a little bit malnourished. He wasn't really, but he was just you could see his head was getting bigger and his back was getting more swayed. And so my teacher essentially was like, okay, well, I'm going to tonify what we would call the kidney, and I'm going to support that energy out of the brain and back into the body, so that we're actually utilizing the energy in a more formed way, in a more holistic way, so that he then has the capacity to then think again more as an adult. Now, he had the potential to be a genius. But by bringing that energy back, that potential is diminished. And my teacher would say, was that a good thing or a bad thing? He had the potential to be a genius, but now you watch his back, his spine, his actual, tangible body adjust with the strengthening of that kidney chi, that kidney essence. We're bringing that energy out of the brain and actually allowing himself to land into his body. He will no longer necessarily be the chess genius that he was moving towards. Now, is that his destiny? Right? It's big, but it's this very interesting idea of when we treat someone back to what we see as their balance, because it makes sense that the body should be strong like a tree. And a swayed lower back is definitely a weakening in a child from an
adult too.
So from this holistic perspective, we could be actually pulling you away from your genius.
I think everyone's a genius in their own right. But the problem with our systems, I'll just call it, is that, we get given a specific information. We've got to remember certain dates, times, events, whatever. But what if you're not good at sitting still and remembering stuff? So I hated school because of that. I was not good at school whatsoever. I wanted to go out and do shit and get my hands dirty and whatever else. So I wasn't a very good student. I had to leave school to become a nerd. And now I enjoy the left brain aspect of it.
Don't you ever.
So moving on.
But it's just a bit of like, yeah.
Yeah, but we're judged according to a specific set of rules.
Yeah.
And if you don't fit that rule, then you've got ADHD or you've got this or you've got that.
Yeah.
And here's a medication for that.
Yeah.
So.
And it is really, it is a bit of a reminder of how these sort of labels and boxes can be quite helpful in some form. But it's also something from my perspective at the very least is that you're not just that. So even if you have been diagnosed with ADD as a child, quite possibly it was because the environment wasn't conducive to the way that you were built to function.
Maybe if you had a high sugar diet as well.
I mean, let's just throw that in. But it's also just being conscious that it's not always terrible to be labelled, but it's also something to be, from our perspective as well, that everything has a piece of mental health attached to it. And so when we think about, well, from my aspect, like, you know, if we look at anxiety from my perspective is related to a dysfunction in the digestive system. And that digestive system isn't just what you eat and digest, but also what you think and consume and digest with all the senses. And so if you're not digesting well, and you had a quote a few months back about, well, if we get this, I think it was about an input and then we don't actually action anything from that, well, then we are bound to be anxious, something along those lines.
Yeah.
And it's like, that makes sense from the TCM perspective because it's like this input has come in and instead of it going around and being digested and moved through the system and like, here's the fruit, here's the poo, and we're good, we can let go of the waste and we can hold on to the piece of fruit that we've got and we can just, you know, accept that and utilize it in whatever way we want, we stay in the loop. And the loop keeps going around and we never get the like, you know, what's that machine where you like just like a vending machine. You put your money in and you get your organic.
So that's action reaction.
Yeah.
So that's the definition of karma.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think they're struggling today because of, let's say, a past life karmic thing. I'm not saying that's not a thing. I think in some cases it very well could be. That's called a miasm. But putting the blame on something like that, first of all, you've given your power away straight away. And also that's looking outside yourself. It's something that's happening to you as a human experiencer. So
human.
Yeah. Sounds better. Sounded so much better in my head. Anyway, moving on.
Human experience, we'll go that. Yeah, okay, so we're sort of separating.
Yeah.
Separating from this experience right now. But that's the same as the box, right? Because it gives us some form of justification. And in that justification, for some people, that gives them a space. Like I've sat in circle a lot and I have... where we sit in circle and we're like, you know, these women are like, this feels really good for me. Like I actually, you know, astrology, for example, our natal chart, I love the natal chart. I love human design. It feels really beautiful, a beautiful interweaving of all these pieces. And it gives me clarity now I understand a little bit more in some way about why I'm straight down the line, why I can be blunt, why some people really find it difficult to understand. Now I do understand. It kind of has given me clarity in that. So it's given me this clarity of like, now, okay, I can rest now. I don't need to keep trying to search and seek and identify what's going on. I can rest in my own mental capacity of who I feel I am, or I can trust who I am in that. And I think that's something that I think when it comes to mental health aspects, like sometimes this these constructs or these concepts, whether that is past life miasms or it's like a label.
It gives it like its own definition. So you got something to work from now.
Yeah.
You've got a base point rather than, you're chasing your own tail and not being able to feel your own feelings. Because with each feeling comes a thought or a bunch of thoughts, and it's really dissecting that. But if you're feeling down and they're not great thoughts, that's really hard to sit with that and make sense of it.
So when it comes to that, for example, say we have someone with let's talk about sadness. So a deep sadness, whether that is through the form of grief or depression, but there's a sadness and we're stuck there. Do we see, what direction would you suggest is a good one to go?
A direction, well, first of all, that's just holding on to the grief or the sadness. And there's a part of the mind, body, spirit complex not wanting to let that go because there is an aspect of safety to it because they are now self-identified with that. So it gives them a sense of self in a way. The approach, sorry, what was the question?
What direction would you take that? How would you support someone that is in that point of not being able to let go or accept?
So for me, it can be a journey, but the first thing you have to do is just say it out loud or write it down and say, this is how I feel. Just get it out of your system. That's the first step in letting go. So the order of creation being thought, word, deed. You've been thinking these thoughts for so long and they've just built up. And then eventually it becomes really heavy to handle the weight of your own thoughts. And from a physical point of view, it often represents a lockdown rib cage and tightness in the upper neck and tension in the jaw because they don't know what to say. They can't handle the weight of their own thoughts. So right up the top of the neck gets jammed up, holding on to some kind of grief or sadness. So their rib cage just locks down. So getting that moving is essential, be it just a simple stretch or something like yoga, just to
focused breathing.
Yeah, just to get moving, get something moving. If you have, with the breathing, if you have air that's trapped in the chest, it's going to be trapped there and it's not going to go anywhere. So the word respiration is really, it's a way of spirit moving through us. So someone who's really sad doesn't have a lot of spirit in them with them. So the first thing you can do is just breathe.
To re-spirit them. That's really cool.
And inspire.
Oh, snap.
But it can be as simple as that. And I've had patients on the table who are depressed and I just get them to breathe properly. And they find it very foreign because they haven't done it for decades properly. But we're all born with the capacity to breathe properly, but we just unteach ourselves how to do it. I think episode 2 is a really good one for that. But it's the mechanics of the breath. If it's stuck here in the chest and it can't get into the abdomen, you don't get that that pressure change in the body. And then everything just gets stuck and then you just start chasing yourself mentally because you're physically not functioning properly. So the mind has to take over. When the mind takes over, then with a certain thought there has to come there will become a feeling attached to it. And then you're going to identify in relationship to that thought feeling. And then if you're sad, you'll likely take it personally. And that just builds up.
And then you're actioning from that thought feeling process.
That's exactly what you've just created.
Yeah. So I guess that's in terms of sadness, that makes sense because it's like, you're not massaging the body with this ability to move.
It's stagnant energy.
Open. It's all a bit stopped and stuck. And I think so the patients that I've worked with when it comes to they've had a big experience, it's always easier because they can identify with that experience. They may have identified with that persona as well. Like you've just, I'm a sad person because I've experienced this. But I have a lot of patients that it's pretty transient experiences of depression, bouts of anxiety and things like that, where they feel as if they've come from, I just don't know where it's come from. Or I have these aches and pains, this discomfort, it makes me feel this way. So they've had the bodily experience, which
So the symptoms.
the symptom,
Yeah.
and they've got the emotion,
Yeah.
and they don't quite feel like, they don't know where it's come from, even though there's lots of different factors. It could have been a plethora of different things, but it just feels like it's not the thing.
Not quite right, yeah.
How would you describe that, or what would you say is going on in that sort of circumstance?
I would say that's soul talking to you.
Right.
And I would see what's the pattern. There'd be some kind of pattern somewhere.
Yeah.
And it could even be an angel talking to you, because you've set up a desire of some kind, consciously or not. You've set up something somewhere. And if you're desiring, what's the desire? Conscious or not?
Love.
So you're going to be really not only given the opportunity to love, but be loved. And if you're continuously blocking that, then it's going to feel a certain way. The opportunity is still going to be there. So that's your ticket to keep doing that. So I would always look for a pattern. You'll notice certain people will come in and out of your life, and these specific people will all have something in common.
So particular types of people are going to keep coming in. They're going to be the similar people. They're going to have the same story. They're going to have the same reminder.
Yeah, and I'll guarantee they're more than likely going to notice something similar in their environment, i.e. certain animal. They just might keep seeing a certain bird, for example. They'll just, I always see that. Or a certain type of car or a certain number plate. It'll just keep coming up into their conscious attention. I always see that blue car, or seeing blue cars all the time now. There's something in that that's worth investigating. Okay,
so another perspective which we have actually touched on before would be, and I've said this to you before, I think on the podcast too, is that could that just be the RAS system?
The
RAS system.
RAS.
So essentially it's like that idea that now that I've focused my attention there, like for example, I do this all the time. I'm on the lookout for a car, type of family car that I'm like, okay, I don't know what I want yet. I'm open, but I'm also like, and so I'll go through phases and there'll be a particular type of car. Then because I've set my focus on that car, I see them everywhere. I'm like, oh yeah, and I'm seeing that all the time. So that would be from a psychological perspective, would be like the RAS system turned on. Would you say that would be that soul talking to you, or the angel talk? Either way.
You can't differentiate
between
mind,
RAS
soul,
or
it's all the same.
Yeah, cool.
Thing, substance. So.
Yeah, and it's just a different way of conceptualizing it, right? So it's like we could, from a biomedical, psychological perspective, we could say, yes, it's the RAS system. And actually we talk about this in one of the episodes, maybe episode 10 or something, and we're talking about how that, the bits and pieces that we do and the focus on that is the way the brain functions, and the way that biomed science has kind of understood the brain and broken it down and created this thing. And, the mental configuration aspect, it really goes into that. The patterns that have come from a thought that are connected to an emotion, or what did you say, thought, word. So I would say thought, emotion, word, deed, action after. Sure. So it's like, those pieces of that puzzle kind of come together, and the Western medical model, especially the psychological model, has kind of broken that down into really simple bite-sized pieces so that we can understand it. But yeah, it is really cool to think of it like, it could be that, but it also could be something quite metaphysical that is gently nudging us.
Absolutely. I have a question for you.
Okay.
Is there a TCM, let's say, definition, for lack of a better word, of the mind, or a concept?
A concept. So it's sort of it exists, and it
thank God.
But one of the things that I find really interesting, and I have mentioned this before, is that in TCM, the brain doesn't really exist.
Yeah, you did say that.
So the brain is connected to the kidney, which is related to the kind of base Jing energetic being. So essentially what mum and dad created at the Big Bang that was the Big Bang of you.
Yep.
And so when your universe erupted into life, and that is what forms the chain that moves up to like the marrow that is then connected to the brain. So the mind sort of it's more interlinked to the process of all the 5 elements.
Right.
So it sort of comes into...
It's all inclusive.
It's all inclusive. Yep. So that it is really that whole spirit, physical, mental, emotional, elemental.
That's what the Greeks would refer to as the psyche. It's like mind, body, soul, spirit, everything.
Yeah. So it's all encompassing. And that's why when I talk about the 5 elements flowing from one to the other, that process never changes. Like the sun going up and going down doesn't change. It's like, it's sort of like this set in stone process. So it's like this movement is forever happening. These cycles are forever happening. We are a part of that. And so if you have a dysfunction somewhere, usually you have a dysfunction in more than one of those areas because there might be a deficiency where there's an excess and we have to support the child, the mother, the grandmother in that way, but it's all encompassing. It's not compartmentalized more than so. It is compartmentalized in that way.
Yeah.
So we have done that series that we did a few months back where it was literally like going through all of those elements, and we were mainly focused on the emotional aspect of those elements, but it is encompassing the physical, tangible, the seasonal. It's all encompassing in that. So do you want to talk about the Tinder date gone wrong?
It's not where I was going with that.
But I mean, we can touch on it again if you like. Well. But it is that, from that medical left brain, not left brain, but that medical perspective, psychological perspective, so they have a very...
Yeah. There's a lot of brain talk when there's talk about mental health. I just wanted to bring up a quick definition of mind by Dr. Dan Siegel, MD, who defines the mind as an embodied process that regulates the flow of energy and information.
Say it again.
Mind is an embodied process that regulates the flow of energy and information. So we talk about the 2 creations, the 2 forces that create the universe, yin and yang. From a scientific perspective, that's energy and information. The flow of those 2 forces, we are an embodiment of those 2 forces. So the mind is the embodied process. In other words, you can't experience mind without a body. You can't experience body without the mind to perceive it. So it's the embodied process that regulates the flow of energy and information. So it goes back to what you were saying, how it's all encompassing. Everything is, if you want to think about it, technically the mind. Absolutely everything. So that's where I was going with that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And I guess just touching on quickly, like there's other mental health aspects that cause a dysfunction in this environment. So for example, schizophrenia or bipolar, those sorts of aspects that would essentially be, it's difficult generally for me as a clinician to treat because it's something that it's sort of your lack of function. You're actually really unwell in this world. You don't, because you can't take care of yourself. And so usually the answer is very high, like heavy medication, a particular space, like a hospital space and things like that. I have watched in China the most amazing experience, which I think I touched on before, where he was a boy, I don't know, I was like 20 something and he was probably just a little bit older than me. And he walked in, and in China, they treat every day. So you go into the hospital every single day and you get with acupuncture specifically, and you get treated until you're better. So if you have like a sickness, now I'm not saying, I'm sure this man was very unwell and took a bit of time before he actually started coming. But when I was in this part of this hospital for 3 weeks, and he came for 10 days. And the first day he couldn't look, he couldn't make eye contact, he couldn't see. I mean, I tried my best with my Chinese and was like, you know, would come out and call out the number, be like, oh, you know, whatever it was. Can't even think of any numbers right now. Ni hao is not a number. I would walk out and I would say like, number this, and I'd practice my Chinese and I'd sort of smile, and it was a bit of a game for me. But he wouldn't look at me. He'd give me his ticket and he'd walk in and he'd lay on the bed. And then we would treat him specifically for schizophrenia, and the doctor was, you know, because they can say whatever they want because people don't understand English. They were just like very like, yeah, well, he's obviously very unwell here. And I'm like, okay, cool. And I didn't have any idea of what could happen. The second day he was able to hand me his ticket. The third day he was able to like look up when I called his name. He didn't make eye contact still. The fourth day I noticed that he could kind of make eye contact, and I can't remember what was happening in between, but by the 10th day he smiled at me and gave me his ticket.
Wow.
And to think that that is the power of energetic medicine, to see someone transform in that way. And obviously I didn't talk to him, but the doctor was like, oh yeah, this is really, you know, this is what you're experiencing. This man he's sort of come out of that psychosis and he's back with us. And I was like, can you tell me more? What was he seeing when he was in there? Can he express what was happening? Does he understand that he's come out? And he's like, yeah, he's very aware. Like we treat people I find in the West that they are forever sick. So if you have a mental health condition or you've got this chemical imbalance, it's bound to happen again. So we have to be on the lookout. So there's like this fear and paranoia that comes with that in the way that we look after someone. And I'm not saying that that's completely invalid or unvalid, because I'm sure that there are people that really do need a lot more help than they're being given. But to watch that happen with this guy, and then I think I saw him around the hospital like a month later, and he was just talking to someone as if he was a completely normal human. Wow. And I was like, what? Like, you know, it's just so
foreign to you.
So foreign to me. Yeah. Because how could someone come in for 10 days and literally transform out of that psychosis to a point where they were functioning a month later, talking like a normal functioning human, communicating. So I think, it's like obviously using the label or using, you know, what I was going to touch on with the like astrology and those aspects, like if that feels good, it's nice to have a little bit of understanding, a little bit of a kind of concept and being able to land, but then also being really conscious that we can get really stuck there and that the answer isn't necessarily to numb.
No, we don't wear it as a name tag. I think realising things like depression is typically being stuck in the past. Anxiety is what's called futurising, always
afraid of the future.
With schizophrenia, it's interesting. I like the shamanic viewpoint of they allow too much reality in. So right now, our conscious mind's only taking in 100, 150 bits of information a second. Well, the typical schizophrenic patient allows 2 to 3 times that in any moment. So it's just too much. They don't have that filtering mechanism in place and functioning. And, you know, something like bipolar as well, where finding that middle ground is just where they struggle to be. And it could be stemmed from childhood, where mother stayed home with them all day, dad was out working and barely saw the child, so it wasn't exposed to those polarities. It only had one polarity. And then when it was exposed to the other one, it was really exposed, too much. So there's the bipolarism, if that's a word, is now. That's how a lot of these labels and diagnoses get set up. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah. And it is, and I think we're going to go into this, I think it's on our list to go into soon, but to really dive into a little bit more of this, the childhood development. And when we go into that, we might get more into this processing and how we are actually creating the configuration.
Yeah. I think also it's important to really touch on a subject that's very taboo in our society, and that's suicide. If we're talking about mental health, I don't think we can ignore that. And really, a lot of people see it as being selfish and being, maybe even being weak or whatever labels are attached to that. Where in my experience, my ex's, my then girlfriend's dad took his own life. And people were saying this, they were saying that. And that's fine to have their opinion. That's kind of almost what, it's almost like you get told to say that when stuff like that happens. So, but what really happens psychologically, and realizing that a lot of people are in a lot of pain and sometimes they just can't take the pain anymore. So, but a lot of people, remember I said a couple of episodes ago that psychologically 90% of people don't graduate past who they were at the age of 12 years old. So the unconscious equivalent would be, think of the person who you seek approval from the most in this world, mum, dad, whoever it is. That person comes to you. Let's say you're 6, okay? So as a 6-year-old, this person comes to you, gives you a set of blueprints and says, you don't get love or approval or whatever you're seeking until this is built, and then just walks away, disappears. Now, as a 6-year-old, you might know what blueprints are, you might know what they're for, but you haven't acquired the life skills to build the thing yet. So as a 6-year-old, you have a tantrum, you do whatever you do, as whatever 6-year-olds do. But as an adult, if you're a 6-year-old in an adult body, there's more options, isn't there? So the average adult in that situation is going to drink something, they're going to sniff something, inject something, whatever else is out there these days, I don't know. They're going to take something that will make them almost feel better. So they'll feel good-ish up to a point, but that substance, that thing's going to wear off inevitably. So after X amount of time of doing that, they come to a fork in the road where they think, okay, I need to sort my shit out here and grow up and be an adult here. Or they just can't see from that childish viewpoint, they can't see that adult, it's too far away. So they've, in their own sphere, they've run out of options.
And so the option is to take their life because it's just too much, too heavy. And would you say that there is any way to help them find either a connection to, what would you say? Because my thinking then is to support them to reconnect to self, because the person that has given them their blueprint and walked away essentially isn't coming back. Or isn't going to be, if there is a parent or whoever you idolize, if they have given you that blueprint and said, fix this, they obviously aren't very aware themselves. So that's unlikely that they're going to be coming back and be like, okay, so this is actually how we build this. Let me help you. Let me guide you. They're not coming back. And so that's sort of not an option. And then I guess this is going to be every person, right? Because, we're always at this point in this fork in the road, potentially not to that extent, but we're at this point in the road, fork in the road, where I'm sure that there are plenty of people that have had this blueprint put onto them and they've had to figure it out themselves. And depending on all the life aspects that came to that point, they were able to go one way instead of the other. But would you say that it's sort of a reconnection to self that is needed in that time, like obviously before the moment where they get to the fork. But if you're watching someone go down this debilitating road where they're literally essentially disconnected completely from self and have just so much pain and heartache, I know that we can't say the right things, right? There's nothing we can really say, but is there something we can do? Like, because there's plenty of people in my world, or at least at arm's length away, that are absolutely abusing medications, drugs, or life experiences in a detrimental, addictive way.
What you can do is, what does that child need? And most of the time, it's some sort of connection, some sort of love. And it could just be someone to play with, like a friend.
Yeah, it's like those three big things, I think, for childhood is sort of the being seen, being heard, and being able to express themselves freely.
Yeah. And if you can provide that, or at least, they might live a long distance away. So a phone call and an email, and just giving them that time and that space, that you yourself have to be strong enough to hold that, I guess, tension of opposites as well. I don't think there is a particular script you can say.
Because I guess that's one of the big things in this world, in the mental health, like, support world. And, when you're watching someone you really love go down this path, and there's a bit of different schools of thought in terms of like how to support them, and enabling them is not the way. I'm not an expert on that, but I can understand how that's not serving them, because if you keep just giving them what they want, I just need money to keep feeding my addiction is not the answer. But then I have read, not so recently, but sort of in the last year or so, about, you just have to stop it. You have to actually hold that line for them. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think people are going to do what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And if there's an addiction, then they're obviously trying to feed something on some level. As I've said before, the physical body feeds on food, emotional body feeds on energy or emotions. The mental body feeds on thoughts. The spiritual body feeds on truth. So what needs nourishing? So probably not the answer you're after, but that's what's just come up.
Yeah, fully. And because at the end of the day, all of those things will need nourishing.
Yeah. Because
none of those things can happen without the whole.
Yeah. So which comes back to the kind of definition of the mind. So the mind is the builder of reality, and the emotions run the body, and it's the physical vehicle that take us towards and away from what we experience. Yeah,
really touching on these really deep conversation topics and points is really important, to actually understand that there's so many ways that we can move and maneuver in this world, and so many ways that we can support each other. And the more that we bring it back to those really simple, basic standards of love, moving from love, being conscious of what we're doing. And
it's also just identifying what we need to feel loved.
Yeah. So that's that question that you said earlier was, how do we support someone in a place where they don't know who they are, or they don't know what's going on, they just feel sad all the time, or they're feeling, these sensations of bipolar. I feel really up and I feel really down. And I know that in the women work that I do, it's really common that, the week before my period, I'm just a whole nother person. And then, we add in some B6, or we add in some vitamins, or we add in some herbs or something. And then it changes that because it levels things out or whatever. It's like that leveling of the brain chemistry, maybe potentially. I would see it differently, like maybe supporting the blood more, helping the chi flow more. But essentially that's what I'm doing. I'm creating this rebalancing of what has been taken out of dysfunction. But this is where what I find really interesting and has really taken my work to a deeper level is that now I'm really looking towards that mental configuration where I'm like trying to deeply pull that forth and not just leave that. You know, I'm not just going to give you the herbs and the supplements that is going to bring you back to balance, because there's a thing that keeps taking you out of balance, and that is something that you're living with every day. And that cycle will continue no matter how many supplements I give you. And at the end of the day, we stop the supplement, it'll come back. And I think that's the same with pill and so many medications, and especially in hormonal health, where like, as a woman, it's really this dance, this flow is essential, and that can be seen as a mental health thing. So when you're feeling sad a few days before your period, it's actually like probably a culmination of sadness that hasn't been expressed in a way that it's needed to be expressed. It's been held and blocked, and you haven't allowed yourself to flow and allow yourself to feel that through the month. So then now we're in this point of let go before as the winter, we're letting go before the bleed starts and move into winter. We're in this autumn space. And if we don't let go now, well, we're not letting go.
Yeah.
And so you get forced into that, and then this big eruption of tears occurs, and I go into a deep sadness, grief, deep dive. I'm depressed. It's like that is a pretty clear indicator that you're not allowing yourself to feel throughout the rest of the cycle. Yeah. But now you've got the opportunity to feel. So fantastic. Let it go.
Yeah.
And watch yourself move into the next space and the next, the winter month of just being cozy and warm and allowing the new experience to ruminate and kind of cultivate this new psychedelic experience, so that you can move into the new and fresh as you move into the next phase post-bleed. But yeah, it is really, retraining that and guiding someone, because at the end of the day, that can feel like, I've had patients that are, so low, like to the point of suicide every month just before their period comes. And it's like, yeah, wow. And the only way that the doctor knows to treat that is to give them lithium or give them really heavy antidepressive drugs. And then they're experiencing these symptoms more and more. And it's like, okay, well, there's a pattern there, like you suggested and touched on a lot, but it's that thing. And it's really it's so common. Because at the beginning, it's actually really healthy to have a let go and a slow down right before the bleed begins. Even for us as for you as a man that's not necessarily cycling, this autumn time is a really beautiful time to let go, and we're about to move into winter, and so that kind of this transition that's happening to the next point, so we've hopefully let go all the things so that we can move into winter, or actually in winter, aren't we? Just kind of like,
so it's really just being, a lot of that is just being brave enough to feel what you need to feel. It's not going to last forever. It probably just needs to run its course.
And that's it. Let's finish on that. And if it's not running its course, that there are people and places that you can lean to, and remind yourself that that could be just your friend, and a phone call to a friend or a message to a person to reconnect and rekindle.
Yeah.
And it always comes back to that centerpiece that is like, I am me. How do I feel? What is going on for me in this moment? Because I am the center of my own universe. And then, if you are experiencing someone that is having a really hard time, there's places and people to connect to. And
absolutely. There's people there for you every step of the way.
Yeah. Really holding you deeply right now. And thank you for listening. We hope you have a beautiful week. See you next time.
Bye, guys.
You've been listening to The Wizard and the Priestess. Thanks for stopping by. Stay connected and be open.